as the other cars come pulling up alongside.
Came through on another crossing where it was right over the bonnet.
We don't know, it's a Bundaberg where the rum comes from.
We're
We're off again.
The harder section, that was just round about Goulburn, wasn't it?
On one Queensland stretch, there are 128 creek crossings in 144 miles, as well as 32 wooden cattle grids, mostly in poor condition. The Han Highway gives no indication of actually being a highway along any of its 300 miles. The road, when you can find it, consists of two wheel tracks separated by grass up to 4 feet high.
Those were the words co-organiser Norm Pleasance used to describe the conditions drivers could expect for the 1955 REDeX Round Australia trial. But really, he could have been talking about any of the three big trials of 1953, 54 and 55. Today you wouldn't want to do this in anything other than a luxury four-wheel drive vehicle. But back then, such vehicles didn't exist. Despite the lack of luxury, 2,000 or more people clamoured to be involved. Little did they know that the REDeX trials would go down in history as one of the greatest adventures of the 20th century. They came at a time when motor racing was recovering from the effects of the Second World War. So when the first ad appeared in 1953 calling for entries, the response was immediate. It was huge and everybody was excited about it. Enthusiasm was high. Hundreds of teams immediately enrolled. They were the brainchild of Red Shepherd, an Englishman on a mission who brought REDeX to Australia in 1949. Arriving with his wife and the REDeX franchise for Australia, New Zealand and New Guinea, they moved into a camping ground. The locals were impressed with the performance of REDeX and he was offered £1,000 to start a company. Not long after, it became a household name.
Up go petrol prices.
But down goes your petrol bill when your garage adds REDeX to your engine oil at every change.
You save at least 5p a gallon on petrol when REDeX cuts friction with 5 exclusive ingredients.
Next oil change, remember,
don't forget the REDeX.
But what exactly was this REDeX stuff? It was, well, actually still is, a scientifically developed additive oil that claimed to chemically improve your car's lubricating oils.
Up goes the cost of motor parts.
but down go your maintenance bills when your garage adds REDeX to engine oil every change.
Tests prove working parts last 1 year longer in every 4 when REDeX cuts friction with 5 exclusive ingredients.
Next oil change, remember,
don't forget the REDeX.
As a marketing ploy, Shepherd masterminded the REDeX Reliability Round Australia trials. He teamed up with the Australian Sporting Car Club and together with Norm Pleasance co-organised the trials. The very first ones were short distances of around 1,600 miles, but it was the big one in 1953 that really caught the nation's attention. It was the longest trial since the New York to Paris of 1908, which was 20,000 miles across 2 developed continents. This one was only 6,500 miles, but it was into Australia's outback. So what, you might ask? Nowadays we can head off into the outback anytime we like. It's no big deal. In fact, if you never go, you'll never know. Well, in 1953, in Australia, it was a big deal. No one drove a standard passenger vehicle into Australia's vast unknown. You had to be totally prepared for anything and everything. Plus, being a little crazy helped. There were no motels, no petrol, and for most part, no roads. Well, not what your average driver would recognise as roads. The idea of the trial was to put ordinary, everyday passenger cars to the test. So, they sent them on stressful long-distance treks over tortuous terrain. The rules and regulations associated with the trial did not allow for speeding. This wasn't a race. In those days, most speedos went up to 100 miles an hour. The speed limit was around 55 miles an hour on highways and 30 miles an hour in built-up areas. Just so you know, I'll be sticking to mileages rather than kilometres, so remember to multiply by 1.61 to convert to metric. When surveying the route, organised devised scheduled speeds based on local conditions, and according to the drivers, they never got it right. Cars could be modified, but no souping up of motors was allowed. Protective measures were encouraged, which included protection of the sump, rear bars and extra petrol tanks. Peter Antill was favourite to win.
His knowledge and skill are a byword in the motorsport of Australia. His car itself is unique in its preparation. All standard seat fittings changed to allow perfect sleeping accommodation.
And there were many other enhancements. Jack Murray recalls what he did to his 39 Chrysler Plymouth.
So we reinforced the springs, put a heavier clutch plate, went from a 9-inch to 11-inch clutch. Special tyres, we got those from Dunlop. The main thing to do with the car, we found, was clearance. If you had enough clearance, you could go anywhere. The fan belt, you get industrial belts, not just ordinary fan belts, an industrial belt that would last you, twice the distance that you were going to travel. You didn't miss a trick.
To make sure these mods were above board, cars were heavily scrutinised 2 hours prior to being flagged off. Car parts were checked for alterations and conditions, then stamped. Any repairs needed along the way had to be made in running time before arriving at the control point. This caused drivers to exceed the scheduled speed to get to the next town in plenty of time to fix what was broken. Though organisers discouraged speeding, there was little that they could do about it. After scrutineering, each car was allotted a score sheet which was checked off at control points. Scores went down 1 point per minute for early or late arrival, 100 points off for a replaced part, or for disobeying an official order, or even worse, disqualification. And if you didn't lose any points, you were called a clean sheeter or a clean skin. And part of the plan for the other drivers was to help rid you of this curse. All in good fun, of course. The winners were determined by this point system. The teams with the least points on their score were the outright winners. So, on August 30, 1953, 192 cars and their crews gathered at Sydney's Moore Park. The teams were made up of either seasoned professionals, people like Peter Antill, an experienced trials driver who was tipped to win this one. Bill McLaughlin, also an experienced trials driver well known for his colourful language and innovation with vehicles. Tommy Sulman, who'd been in the motorsport game most of his life. Lex Davison, a wealthy manufacturer who competed in Monte Carlo. And Jack Murray, superb sportsman and infamous larrikin. The other side saw the privateers ready for an adventure of a lifetime. As the whole nation watched and followed their trials and terrors, some of these people were to become household names for 14 days in 1953. Cheered on by a 50,000 strong crowd, the competitors were flagged off at 3-minute intervals.
Right on starting time, and there goes the first car, pushing through a mass of people lining the route for miles. More than 200,000 saw the car set out, and just as many will see them return, or those that do return. Car number 2, a little Morris Minor, passes the starting line exactly 3 minutes later. Competitors lose 1 point for every minute they're late or early at each control point. Mr. W. Wager of Victoria in a Ford Custom line. As we go to press comes a flash that this car was wrecked outside Bundaberg and 2 people were injured. 6,500 miles to go. Sydney to Brisbane, Townsville, Darwin, Alice Springs, Adelaide, Melbourne and back to Sydney. And before they get properly going, they're being nipped for bridge toll. It's no good, fellas. Sydney or the bush, the taxes get you just the same.
The enthusiastic crowd jammed the way, making it hard for the trial cars to get through. Extra police were called in to help control them. Finally, at 27 minutes to midnight, the last car, a Renault, driven by Brisbane team Bill Mayer and Cliff Taylor, was flagged off. Before the trial started, 6 of the 192 entrants were disqualified or withdrew for various reasons. One unnamed driver was arrested for being unlicensed. He returned later, hopped into his car and began the trial. Though when he returned, he was due for a trial of another sort. The first scheduled stop was Newcastle. Most vehicles arrived early with up to an hour to spare before checking in. Only 2 teams were late. One of these was an Austin A40 driven by Mrs. Winifred Conway, a 63-year-old grandmother. Conway's pleasant demeanour earned her the respect of her fellow competitors. It also made her a favourite of the press and public alike. She was in it for the thrill, that's for sure. For as she rightly pointed out, the prize for an Austin is only a new toaster. Number 98, a Sunbeam Talbot, was the only all-woman team. Helmed by sisters Lois and Nola Rowe with Diana Brunton, all 3 were in it for the fun. The drive to Newcastle was easy. The only hazard was the enthusiasm of the spectators as they lined Hunter Street to welcome the team. Red Shepherd announced that everything was running like clockwork. One driver may not have agreed. Eric Hoy of Wangaratta, the first car scheduled out of Sydney, was 30 minutes late leaving. The first of the reported pranks took place in Tamworth. On the Sunday night, crowds lined the streets near the official refuelling station in Bridge Street. Only a few cars made it. In the next morning's paper, 2 small notices shed light on the situation. Rival garage owners had torn down the signs which were to direct the cars to the official garage. Instead, they redirected the cars to their own garages. Police closed down at least one of the offenders, but many others persisted through the night. The trip onto Brisbane through Glen Innes saw 15 people booked for speeding despite the pea-soup fogs encountered. Just over the Queensland border in Warwick, E. Hamey in his Chrysler reported a broken differential and withdrew. On a brighter note, this invitation from a local garage demonstrates the enthusiasm the trial sparked. The early morning saw the first cars into Queensland's capital. Bill McLaughlin was ahead in the rush to Brisbane. He was 3 hours ahead. From the moment the cars drove into Perry Park, no work could be carried out on them. Crowds of people cheered the competitors, inspected the vehicles and encouraged the drivers with well wishes. Families came with picnic teas and the kids in pyjamas and dressing gowns.
Right on time, 9:32 a.m., number 1 enters the control point. The Queensland Sporting Car Club were in charge and the organisation was meticulous. It had to be. Every minute, early or late into control, was 1 point lost. Number 2 signs on with no loss of points. In fact, nearly every car was a clean skin at this point. There'd been no call yet for the compulsory emergencies in every car. 1 gallon of water for every crew member, food rations for a week, 50-foot tow rope, de-ditching gear, first aid kit, and fuel for 400 miles. This Citroen typifies the large entry from continental manufacturers. Australia, Britain, France, Germany, USA, Italy, and Czechoslovakia are all represented. Estimated total value, £250,000.
The drivers, refreshed from several hours' sleep, left 12 hours later. By then, the crowds had swelled from the hundreds to the thousands. All cars left on time, with all Queensland competitors having clean sheets.
We're off again. Number 150, D. Williams, New South Wales, MG, 9 minutes past 4 in the morning. Peter Antill, 160, half an hour later.
On the 2nd of September, newspapers carried the headline, car trial already a nightmare. The stretch from Brisbane to Rockhampton, a distance of around 500 miles to be covered in 12.5 hours, saw a series of 7 accidents and 3 competitors forced to abandon the field. The troubles were blamed on driver weariness and the weather. Several days earlier, over 7.5 inches of rain had fallen around Bundaberg. The rain caused flooding and heavy road damage. Number 32, a Ford V8, plunged over an embankment near Gin and somersaulted 45 feet into a riverbed. Both the driver, Ivor Patience, and the navigator, John Binks, were taken to hospital with fractures and minor injuries. The car was a write-off, and so they withdrew from the trial. Another accident occurred when BJ Cunningham became confused at the cemetery turnoff near Childers. His Holden skidded on a wet road and slammed into an embankment. Cunningham broke his collarbone and withdrew. A third accident involved number 3, another REDeX Ford V8, driven by Bill Wager and John Boult and a local farmer in his custom line. One of the farmer's passengers, Elizabeth Craig, a 3-year-old, was taken to hospital with head injuries. Damage to number 3 was extensive and the team withdrew. While permission was sought from local council to include Bundaberg as a control point, the info didn't filter down to local traders. They were disappointed that there was no time to organise a hearty welcome for the weary drivers.
Below the air zone REDeX welcome sign, an hour and a half before anyone was expected. Number 1 failed to arrive, but the control opened on time, 4:32 a.m. It was only a 2-minute time check, and the cars are soon away again.
In Rockhampton, it was another story. There, the trial teams received 5-star treatment. Rocky garage owners went all out with 24-hour servicing, a complete oil and grease in under 25 minutes. Hotel and pub owners opened their doors and provided beds, meals and showers around the clock for all team members. When complaints about the toughness of the trial reached organisers, their response was, "You've had a picnic run this far," and things didn't get any better. Roadworks between Rocky and Mackay meant unplanned detours and delays. On the stretch to Townsville, bushfires and more fog reduced visibility to 0 around Marlborough, which forced another 3 drivers to retire from the trial. Of 186 starters, 173 teams continued. Jack Murray, number 119 in a Chrysler Plymouth, complained that the trip from Brisbane had been too easy. 50% of the cars have been about 2 hours ahead. We had time to change springs and shock absorbers.
And so into control point number 5, Mackay, 1397 miles from Sydney. Old hand at this game, Les Barrows, driving Vanguard Spacemaster number 74, gets the official signal to carry on after the 2-minute time check. And there goes Grandma, doing extraordinarily well and loving every minute of it.
Car number 15, nicknamed The Bomb and driven by Keith Wilson from Wollongong, broke its wheel and pinion. A nearby farmer had an identical part and it was fitted to the car. Actually, Wilson had borrowed an old taxi from a mate after his own car was in a smash on the way to the trial. The borrowed one was an old 39 Chev. It had already been in 2 smashes and Wilson had only a few hours to prepare it for the trial. Wilson's perseverance in the light of what he encountered was truly admirable, if not amazing. The old Chev blew a gasket just 7 miles short of the Townsville control point barrier. Using the starter motor, the team got across the line on time and without loss of points.
By the time they reached Townsville, everyone badly needed sleep. There was a 24-hour break here, and every minute of it was gratefully accepted after the strain of the last 3 days. We camped at the sports ground and no one stirred before sunup, even then reluctantly. A girl newspaper reporter joins Granny for a wash and brush up. If you have to shave, a car window makes a good mirror.
When drivers looked ahead to the long stretch of dirt from Townsville to Mount Isa, the first elimination section, they put their watches away and focused on the speedometer. Things were about to heat up. The fastest time would determine the winner in case of a dead heat, and this is what the REDeX trial organisers had dreaded, that the trial would become a dangerous high-speed race. The road to Isa was miles of treacherous curves, followed by straight stretches of soft red or black dirt. It was also littered with rocky outcrops, corrugations, washouts and unbridged creeks. And there were 70 miles of jump-ups, which at night were next to impossible to see. If that wasn't enough, the road was only wide enough for one car at a time. The road was known locally as the Calamity Trail, a reputed killer. Top enders placed bets on everything from the outright winner to how many roos or drivers would be killed. And with vehicles travelling up to 80 miles per hour in 60 mile an hour zones, accidents were bound to happen. Stopping in Julia Creek to refuel, locals greeted teams with cuppers and directions, but mostly they looked on incredulously. It can't be done, they said. On September the 4th, the field leader was a Holden, number 5, driven by South Australian Arthur Possum Kipling. Arthur startled the sleepy but eager residents of Cloncurry as he sped through at 90 miles an hour. There were at least 5 major accidents on the Calamity Trail, though only 2 vehicles were forced to withdraw. One of those teams was George and Norman Hazel in a 1928 Chevrolet, the oldest car in the trial. It overturned between Julia Creek and Mount Isa. Suffering back and chest injuries, they made their way to a nearby railway line, poured petrol over the sleepers and set them alight to attract the attention of a nearing train. Amazingly, the train crew failed to notice them. Lucky for the Hazels, a second train came along shortly afterwards, saw them and called for an ambulance. 5 days over rocky outcrops, sand and stone, the bomb underwent major on-road repairs. Wilson explained to a reporter,
"The axle has bent an inch or 2 in the middle. We've had no time to take it off the car to get it straightened, so we plan to jack the front end up in the middle, heat it with an oxy torch and stand on the front until it straightens. Then we'll be off to Darwin."
200 miles before Isa, number 9, Barry Gurdon's Austin, damaged a wheel hub. 6.5 hours later, number 9 was back on the road. 3 miles on, the car's reading light fused and started a fire. The crew cut the wiring, the car's electrics badly damaged. Even so, they managed to get started and raced a mile a minute to arrive right on time. And what of Grandma Conway? Upon her arrival in Isa, she was reported to have praised her vehicle, "You Little Ripper," while she patted the bonnet. And when asked about the Calamity Trail, she replied, "It was a little ripper too." But the man to eat his words was Jack Murray. His car overturned 3 times and he was forced to pull out. Jack explains what happened.
We turned that over. We flipped it over in an up jump, come out on one of these, come out the last one, there was a bull standing in the middle of it. We come down and swung to avoid the bull, and when we come out, the road turned hard left. Hit the bank, it was about 18 inches, and it just flipped it over, boom, like that, on its side. The windows flew out, Bill flew out, and the winch flew out, hit him on the head, gave him concussion. I'll never forget it.
By the end of the Calamity Trail, only 46 cars were clean sheeters. This lot included the road team in their Sunbeam Talbot. They impressed everybody with their driving, as well as their attention to personal grooming. They had voltage regulator problems and spent 36 sleepless hours coaxing their low-powered, low-slung Sunbeam Talbot over the trial's toughest road. They'd fractured the sump, taped it together and kept going. By the time they made it to Isa, the control point was a madhouse. The Calamity Trail, true to its name, took its toll. Dust-covered and exhausted, the teams rested in Isa for just 12 hours before heading out for Darwin. Over 90 degrees in the shade, with the sticky dust being stirred up by the cars, it was a hellhole. Eric Hoy, car number 1, withdrew, exclaiming, "It's madness to go on." And all but the first arrivals claimed that navigation was a breeze. You only had to follow the trail of hubcaps and engine parts. But who'd done the impossible? Who'd done the Calamity Trail in the shortest time? Back on good roads, drivers reported it was monotonously smooth. Darwin was a chance to rest and relax for 36 whole hours. One unlucky team arrived an hour ahead of schedule. Exhausted, they went to sleep just outside the control point. They woke up 10 minutes after they were scheduled to check in. Some drivers headed off to a barbecue at the Cox's place, the president of the Darwin Car Club. Others went to the beach for a swim. Darwin Oval was set up for crews to sleep and local traders provided refreshments. On their last night there, Sunday night, a huge buffet was put on for the teams. Radio personality Jack Davey, number 107 in a Ford Custom line, faced disqualification for having illegal springs. The officials had received a formal complaint about Davey and planned to hear his side of the story at the end of the trial.
Dry charge battery has changed all that.
The scoreboard at this halfway point had 11 leaders, all clean sheeters. The second elimination section was to come. But fearing there would not be an outright winner, the Australian Sporting Car Club president, Dan McFarlane, announced the possibility of a secret deviation. This would be an elimination section, a horror section, between Melbourne and Sydney if there was no single outright leader by the time the drivers reached Melbourne. The crews left Darwin wide-eyed and bushy-tailed, nursing their vehicles to Tennant Creek.
We hit Tennant's Creek, a copper and gold mining town, in the middle of the night. Practically every competitor is ahead of time and garages work overtime, giving service. A wire mesh is necessary over a windscreen broken by a galah, bird, of course. There's time only to replace tyres, change oil and examine shock absorbers and springs. Feverish preparation for the tough run south from Alice Springs. For the drivers, the Tennis Street stop means time out for coffee, as black as you like to make it. Local teenagers combined a square dance with a welcome to the drivers. But there's no need for music to soothe the savage breast when a man's dog-tired. Hey, Jack?
Then onwards to Alice, in anticipation of the next bad stretch, the second elimination stretch to Kingunya. If this stretch was to be anything like the Calamity Trail, the drivers were, quite frankly, pretty worried. On a brighter note, Mrs. Conway's popularity was skyrocketing. Bags of fan mail waited for her at the Alice. Included was a telegram from the Australian Women's Weekly, telling her she'd be presented with a spanking new toaster, regardless of her position in the trial. At 8:31 a.m. on the 10th of September, the drivers hightailed it out of Alice, their last memory of it being 50 children frantically waving them off. Locals predicted much trouble as the Kingunya Road was known to disappear in the dust and would probably totally break up under constant pounding. Lex Davison was determined to take the lead from Kipling and break the time allowed for this nightmare stretch.
"30 miles out of Cooper Pedy, the opal mining town, we entered the security area controlling the Woomera rocket range. All cars have been issued with passes, received the OK and passed on.
Davison arrived in Kingunya over an hour ahead of time, declaring the desert was terrible. Others did not fare as well. Broken windscreens, broken tail shafts, blowouts and boilovers were the order of the day.
Frank Kleinig will tell you that. He was doing 60 when he hit a 6-foot washaway, bursting both front tyres and flattening the rims. When we arrived, he was semi-conscious, but working like a navvy to make a double change. Frank thought this stop would cost him a win in the under 1100cc section, but it didn't. Kingunya on any map is just a spot. Don't let the large type fool you. It's really no more than a village for railway peddlers. But it is a control point and it has the first pub for 1,000 miles. All cars are fighting time. Sleepy Kingunya startled by screaming tyres on the square as Zephyr 136 races into the control. And the control, bless the organisers, is right opposite that pub.
The Alice Kingunya leg had not sorted out the leadership as was hoped. There was still 11 clean sheeters. The secret horror stretch was in. All the vehicles suffered from the fine dust that infiltrated the engine parts. The drivers, although cheery, also suffered the strain. Many of them had to take over-the-counter drugs like Benzodrine to keep them going. Many vehicles were hit by rocks and stones, and many vehicles hit birds, cattle and horses. And when Lloyd Davies hit a large roo, he was temporarily blinded by a spray of blood. Other things turned red too. Upholstery and Duco, plus drivers' clothes and hair, but not from blood, from the Central Australian red bull dust. The stretch to Adelaide saw Lex Davison lose the field to South Australians Kipling and John Hughes. They were over 2 hours early, even though they hobbled the last 100 miles in second gear. Their reception into Morphettville was unprecedented. Local dealerships congratulated teams, including Barry Gurdon in his Austin A40. Gurdon was 2 3/4 hours late to this showing, having been hanging upside down in the driver's seat when his vehicle overturned. On a serious note, more complaints were received, this time about the Holden team replacing parts. However, the Sporting Car Club refused to acknowledge these complaints unless they were in writing and accompanied by a £5 deposit. The road out of Adelaide was packed tight with well-wishers. Compared to what they'd just endured, a smooth bitumen road was equal to a Sunday picnic. The first vehicle into Melbourne was a Rover, number 13, driven by Victorian Eddie Perkins. Nearing the control, he just missed a truck, and if he hadn't swerved sharply, all would have been goners.
Melbourne, graceful capital of Victoria. The control point here was in the Army Barracks, a significant tribute. Through the thronging crowd, despite the late hour of arrival, Army cyclists guided the entrance. It's a welcome typical of the entire journey, and the drivers, tired, dusty and hungry, got new energy when they saw it. All drivers are good and ready for the kind of hospitality that only the Army can offer.
After a sleep and a feed, everyone relaxed, some heading off to the Newsreel Theaterette to watch the latest report on the trial. But the cheerfulness of the drivers was undermined by rumours of the secret horror detour. Drivers weren't to be given the details until they left Melbourne. John Marshall, in number 48, a Peugeot, who had not lost any points so far, was reported to have said that it would be fairer to put only the clean sheeters through the extra test. With the horror detour weighing on their minds, they arrived in Albury. Kipling was first through. He told the tale of the U-bolt that had worked itself loose. When he stopped to repair it, he removed his false teeth and stuck them in his pocket. 8 miles down the track, he couldn't find them. "Bugger the trial," he said. "I want my teeth." The team had to return to the scene and just managed to rescue them from the dust seconds before Lex Davison roared through. Peter Antill had ordered detailed maps of the surrounding areas in the hope they would help. Other drivers waterproofed everything they could, fearing what was ahead. One crew concocted a snorkel from the exhaust from 2 radiator hoses and made a splashboard to protect the radiator. From 4 AM in dense fog, Goulburn crowds cheered and cheered. but the drivers were distracted by their own growing anxiety. Kipling, once again the first through, did not stop longer than needed and hurtled towards the unknown. The secret elimination route was made public as the first drivers headed out to Goulburn. The horror route was 11.6 miles in length. The cars turned left at Marulan, passed through Brayton and on to Canyon Lee. Then back to the highway near Paddy's River, which they had to cross. The route hadn't been used for some time, but drivers with a knowledge of the area cried, "It's the last straw."
No room to pass, little room to maneuver, a dangerous nightmare journey. It was like a cross-country fox hunt without a horse, testing drivers down to the last filling in their last tooth, and cars to the first minor rattle in built-in ashtrays. This was a section that broke so many hearts. It was designed to, but the hard luck stories were legion. Wet brake lining, swamped distributors, wrong turning, stalled engines, even the lowly, humble puncture. Right here, let's pay a tribute to Telegraph reporter Tom Farrell in this custom line. He drove, reported the trial, and still finished well. So many stalled in the deep creeks that 40 of the drivers could have formed a choir to sing One More River to Cross.
Now, let's have a chat with the man who selected the horror stretch, Mr. Des Pinn. Is it true you were responsible for it, Des?
Yeah, I was, entirely. I was asked by the organiser committee from Sydney, because I came from Goulburn. I used to try how fast I go around corners and things, yeah, in the dark at night. And I learnt a lot of those areas and the bad roads.
Did you have much notice to get the road ready? And how did you decide the timing for it?
I had to do it in 14 hours, what? I did it and drove to Sydney and gave them the message. We can do it. Nobody knew where that section was. We turned off 6 miles from Marulan to Brayton. It actually through properties, but it is actual road. But nobody used it in those days. I did it with the gates open. I did it in just under the 17 minutes. The others didn't believe me. They moved it down to 13 minutes. It was impossible. And a few people were a bit upset by that. But to do it in safety, I had between 30 and 40 flagmen, and we buried flags beyond that to find the road. It was so bad. And they had 3 major water crossings. The biggest was Paddy's River, and my brother was at the start. I was at the end. We were ready for the first car, and somebody who dropped out of the trial drove into it. He put a fire in the middle of the road and decided to boil the billy. I had to come back. I knocked his fire off the road. I gave him a few minutes to be out of that section. Otherwise, when I come back, he would be small pieces. I was slightly angry. And when I come through, they were very nicely staggered by a quarter of a minute each time, all the way, down to about 20 minutes, 21 minutes. So it worked out beautifully. It was fun.
Looks like it, Des. What a roller coaster. Meanwhile, Sydney-siders were preparing for the home stretch. Organisers expected a crowd of 200,000.
For more than 100 miles, the road to the city was lined with cheering crowds.
Excitement was at a peak. On the 14th of September, The outcome of the knockout route was headline news. But as the homecoming crowds waited, the ceremonies had a false start. Spectators gasped and cheered. The first REDeX competitor to arrive was number 60, a Citroen. Organisers were confused. At last report, the Citroen was somewhere between Adelaide and Melbourne. When 3 occupants admitted a hoax, the crowd cheered good-naturedly.
And now we're able to bring you Mr. A.L. Kipling himself, the first man to officially cross the line and check in at his correct time. How do you do, Mr. Kipling?
Very well, thank you.
How are you feeling now that it's all over? Pretty tired, I suppose.
I mean, it's a great relief, really, now that it's over. I mean, we've been tensed up pretty well on the trip, wondering if we're going to make the next section or not on time, but now that we've been lucky enough to get through with a reasonable good figure, we're quite happy, really.
And how did the hold and hold up on the
Very
trip?
good, very good. Apart from 2 broken U-bolts, we haven't put a spanner on it.
And no repairs apart from that, eh?
No repairs whatsoever.
How was the hospitality on the way around, Mr. Kipling?
Well, the further we went, the better it got. It was just, too wonderful to believe, really.
Did you have any close shaves at all?
Oh, we had quite a few, really. Skidding into trees. I mean, you go around some of those bush tracks, 60, 70 mile an hour, where you get on the loose dirt on the top, and naturally you go into a skid and you're not very sure whether you're going to miss the trees or not, but we were fortunate and missed them.
Well, the car seems to be in pretty good condition.
Well,
well, now, your impressions must be perhaps a little muddled at this stage of the game, seeing that you're rather tired, but have you got any idea as to any modifications that you would think of for future trials of this nature?
Well, we've learned a terrific amount about trial on this trip, and we've got a lot of things that we will put on if we have a go again.
I see. Well, thank you very much indeed, sir.
Good day.
And congratulations.
Thank you.
Privateers Ken Tubman and John Marshall were declared provisional winners. They won by a single point, lost over the knockout route. Peter Antill arrived settling 3rd place, but Tubman and Marshall had to wait 6 long hours for Ken Robinson to arrive to know that they had won by a point. Of course, everyone had to wait until all the stragglers were in. All vehicles were checked over and all protests had to be heard before Tubman and Marshall were declared the outright winners. When the announcement was made, they received £1,000 cash and a new car each. Tubman extolled the virtues of the mostly unknown Peugeot and its suitability for Australian conditions. The pair had done nothing to the car to prepare it, except protect the petrol tank. 11 Peugeots were entered and all finished the trial. Tubman and Marshall were popular winners. Besides being a private entry, they were as surprised as anyone that they had won. That the trial had consisted of many trade entries was a great bone of contention for the private entries who had to scuttle for whatever they needed. Tubman and Marshall hadn't given themselves a chance in hell of winning and claimed they got all the lucky breaks.
I have great pleasure in presenting the £1,000 to Mr. Tubman and Mr. Marshall.
And what of the people who'd become celebrities during the 14 days of the trial? Of the other clean sheeters, this is how some of them fared over the elimination route. Lex Davison, millionaire shoe manufacturer with a taste for fast and dangerous cars, lost 22 points. The Perkins brothers in their Rover 75 lost 46 points. Radio personality Jack Davey, number 107 in a Ford Custom Line, crossed the finish line at 9 p.m, 36 minutes ahead of schedule. He'd lost 681 points on the board. At each stopover, Davey reported back to the nation from a local radio station. He was overwhelmed by the affection the nation had shown him. Even way out on the Calamity Trail, fans had a way of letting him know that they were 100% behind him. Tearing along one night, they rounded a curve, and right there in front of them was the biggest, muddiest hole. And right in the middle of that was this.
Hi-ho, everybody!
Grandma Conway was really the man of the moment. There was a section she hadn't completed and had lost nearly 2,000 points. But points didn't interest her. Her main aim was to enjoy herself. The only trouble she'd encountered was the need for a grease and oil change. Still, an Austin dealer offered to swap her car for a new one. How lovely. You beaut, she cried, and then planted a kiss on the messenger. And don't forget, her new toaster was also presented by the Women's Weekly. The trial was estimated to have cost around £84,000. That included costs for each vehicle, which were estimated to be in the vicinity of about £1,000. This did not include cash for parts that may have been needed. 192 entrants at the start. 136 completed the trial. 6 withdrew at the beginning and 50 did not complete the course. The trial was hailed an enormous success, acclaimed as the toughest test in the world and the best test of a car's reliability, and Australia wanted more. Plans for the 1954 REDeX trial were already underway before the first one was over. By October 1953, 190 applications were received by the Australian Sporting Car Club. By the closing date, entries totalled 263. This time the route was to be over 9,600 miles, to take in Western Australia and to be completed over 18 days. Much of the way was on dirt or unmade roads. This time, the rules were stricter and with greater penalties. Secret controls were established along the way to prevent competitors from building up time or performing extensive overhauls on cars. Modifications were limited to only those available from the factory at no extra cost. Road springs could be strengthened but not changed. Extra lights could be included but not at a greater wattage than the car's standard lights. Rear bars were encouraged but were not to strengthen the car's front end. A minimum of 550 miles worth of petrol and emergency provisions were mandatory additions to the loads that they were already carrying. As the Australian Women's Weekly team said,
"After we 3 sit in the car, there is space left for 1 person. And in that space, all the equipment has to be fitted."
Inspector Gribble from the New South Wales Police Traffic Branch spoke to the drivers about speeding and road safety. He explained that they would be booked if they broke the law. The organisers were determined it would be a safer trial, but a better test of reliability. The excitement the trial caused was immense. There were several competitions, including the Muller Coolacore Best Beard competition. The driver, who sported the best beard grown on the trial, would win £150. Sponsorship was also greater, with a wider variety of companies getting into the act.
Big business takes special interest in the trial, and this firm, for instance, added a prefabricated house to the first prize money of £2,000.
Hold on, is that Jack Brabham? Let's see it again. It is! The 1954 trial was his only ever trial. He didn't do well, and well, never entered a trial again. Meanwhile, the Petrov affair had erupted, and both events vied for first place as front page news. The two became linked, and according to this cartoon, spectators weren't sure what they were watching. So amidst the danger of international intrigue, the nation was on the edge of their seats when on July 3rd, 1954, the trial began. The REDeX trial, that is. Once again, spectators gathered at Moore Park. They cheered and waved and encouraged the teams as they left the grounds. Visiting English crooner Donald Pearce was the official starter. He even sang an adaptation of his hit tune, "Yes, I've Told Them All About You." Dead on noon, he flagged off the first car.
9,600 miles to go, and the first car flagged out of Sydney Showground is a standard 8. There are 246 cars to follow them, leaving at 2-minute intervals in an 8-hour-long procession. Second car off is a Peugeot, driven by the New Zealand team. They'll find the Australian outback a lot different from Rotorua. You can drive for more than 30 miles without hitting a volcano. And there goes Grandma Conway. Good luck to you, Granny. This character apparently thinks he can do the trip on his head. He must have some secret control all of his own, unless, of course, his car's advertising headache powders. Radio star Jack Davies in it again, driving a Ford Custom Line. Last year he lost a lot of points and a little weight, but he drove every inch of the way himself.
it wasn't all grease, oil and beards. This year's trial included a little sex and glamour.
Wild horses or even leopards wouldn't keep Lucille Christian of the Arthur Murray School of Dancing out of it. She's an American girl and reckons it's no place for poodles. What would a dog do in all those treeless wastes?
Winifred Conway, last year's favourite with press and public, lost 9 points for a late start. Her crew hadn't turned up, and so she had to go off and collect them. And this year there was no bridge toll to pay because an engineering company had generously prepaid all of them. The crowds were more disciplined, but more determined to get to the cars. While stopped on the side of the road, some cars reported being mobbed by kids. In Newcastle, the local Boy Scouts sold tickets at the control point for their function that night. With only 2 minutes allowed at the checkpoint, not many crews had the opportunity to participate, but the locals still had a whale of a time. The first secret control was encountered just after the Bulladila climb, and many entrants lost points. Their plan was to protest given a discrepancy in distance between their official maps and the ones used by the control. It was a difference of about 2 or 3 miles, which made them early, but only by a few seconds. Ken Tubman, last year's winner, claimed the slow speed and anticipation of secret controls put extra strain on drivers. Onwards to Taree, the next official checkpoint. Local entrants Alan Yerd, Don Wright and Bill Nelson in number 166, a Space Master, received a huge welcome from the crowds in Victoria Street. Yerd & Co lodged a formal complaint about the secret control and their loss of points. Several cars got lost and it was suspected that signposts were changed or removed. All in all, Taree gave a great welcome, proud to be part of the trial. The big trouble between Sydney and Brisbane was a 400-yard bog, 8 miles out of Wauchope, that trapped just about every car. Adding fuel to fire, signs had been taken down and around 15 teams tramped over to a nearby farm to ask for directions.
Sunday morning found us near Coffs Harbour, northern New South Wales. Not much trouble to any of the drivers or cars, and most of them crossed the Tweed River Bridge without any loss of points. The border, and Bill McLaughlin's Zephyr slides into Queensland at a leisurely pace.
Brisbane Control, and the first car to start is first in with a clean score sheet. The car looks surprisingly spick and span after the 600-mile trip through rain and mud. And Gordon Marshall and Norman Williamson look pretty fresh too as they sign in at the control point. Second arrival, also without losing points, is Kay Berger's New Zealand entry. They haven't lost any whiskers either. More and more cars arrive at the Brisbane Exhibition Ground, where they will stay for a 12-hour rest period. With cars arriving continuously for 8 hours, most of them on schedule too, control officers of the Australian Sporting Car Club are kept pretty busy. More starters in the best beard contest. Bill McLaughlin and navigator Marty Higgs relax after checking in.
This eventful and controversial run was vastly different to the 1953 start, which was pretty smooth sailing by comparison. It wasn't so much the conditions, but the regulations that were killing it. Lex Davison, who had undertaken the pre-trial survey, arrived in Maryborough sound asleep. He was reported to have said, "I've had this trial. It isn't even a cruise. We're not even allowed to drive as fast as the public. With this new system of secret controls which have killed the thrill in the trial, it will certainly be a flop." Other drivers echoed his sentiments. Later, teams had learnt that their protests had been upheld and points were restored. But at this stage, it was still anyone's game. Arriving in Rockhampton, crowds were enthusiastic. but the gimpy secret control caught some drivers out. Confusion reigned, as apparently everyone had a different version of the scoring process. This led to arguments and further protests. The trial seemed to be turning into a test for navigators who were becoming nervous wrecks. To avoid point losses, they had to plan at least 1,000 miles ahead to be sure that they were always within 1/10 of a mile accurate. Illness dogged several competitors, including Jack Davey, who slipped and twisted a vertebra. He refused to withdraw and continued to drive himself after having been injected with proctocaine. Between Rockhampton and Townsville, the secret controls were removed. The Australian Sporting Car Club reacted to the protests of competitors. Surprisingly, competitors became angry, saying, if they've started to use them, they should continue. Stories had leaked out that trade entries had their own scout cars which warned of impending secret controls.
This is a subtropical city, Mackay, with citizens in customary midwinter shirt sleeves. It's a wealthy town and popular with winter tourists from the south. Out from Mackay, Townsville ahead, and no points lost for Bob Sears in his Peugeot. Or Bill McLaughlin in his Zephyr. Others aren't so lucky. J.B. Cook has to stop for minor repairs. He'd lost only 7 points to Rockhampton, but is able to get going again. And what's this, another hold-up? Well, not exactly, it's just a friendly get-together. Driving in the tropics is thirsty work, and that dust takes some settling. At left is Andy Spanner, who later turned his Chevrolet over, was unhurt and got back in the trial. 8th Victorian driver Lex Davidson is always up with the leaders. We're following close behind as the first crowds indicate that we're nearing the third major control in this grueling trial, Townsville. So far, we've come nearly 1,700 miles, about 1/5 of the entire journey, and more than half the entrants have lost points. Lucille Christian has lost points, but none of her chic.
But what about the trial itself? How were the cars faring? There were still too many clean sheeters, and it was still anyone's game. The women's weekly entry had received gifts all along the way. Food, flowers and good wishes decorated their vehicle. They were amongst the clean sheeters and were feeling very confident. Jack Murray, who had complained about the trial at this stage last year, was also among the clean sheeters. Not much had been heard about him. In fact, not much had been heard about any of the drivers. The emphasis was on the secret control controversy. Up to Townsville, drivers complained of boredom, of the trial being too easy. The obstacles encountered so far, the bogs, the dust and the roos, were all too far apart. But without doubt, this was about to change. Their dream, or nightmare, was about to come true. Those who had been on last year's trial knew what was ahead and spent much of their time in Townsville resting up and making the most of the available comforts, all in preparation for the horror stretch to Isa. Early reports told of high winds whipping up the soft dust. The land hadn't seen rain for some time. Other areas were reported to have had recent heavy rains and turned the road into thick bogs. These conditions and the possibility of secret controls hung heavy over the drivers' heads as they headed out through Charters Towers.
On this long stretch, bad roads and secret controls will chalk up points to all but 3 contestants. There are a few unscheduled hazards too. Westward ho to Mount Isa. Got him! Now the tempo quickens, speed and still more speed. But no car could race over this section, a dried-up riverbed that tests springs and tires. You don't have to be in the trial to get trouble. Sorry, brother, but it's all yours. Under the railway bridge, and Arthur Murray's not in a hurry. Or driver Lucille Christian isn't. She was forced to drop out on the next leg. This is really rugged going. The kind of road, well, they call it a road, that tests suspension and shock absorbers to the very limit. Well out into the Australian bush, and these tracks certainly weren't made for Sunday drivers. They're rough, and the hazard of dust is beginning to take its toll. Well, all the goats aren't in the trial. S. Carpenter noses his Zephyr gingerly into a dried-up creek bed. We said it wasn't for Sunday drivers. Slow down, or you'll hit that water too fast. It's the unexpected that can cost points, or can wreck a car in a matter of seconds. A standard from Victoria takes the water jump in its stride. Doug Parker of Sydney, 1 point only lost and going particularly well.
Control points along the way were open day and night and were always busy. The worst bogging occurred at Pentland Creek, where residents had filled the crossing with sand to make it easy to cross. But it was the sand, in fact, that caused the bogging. Residents stayed on hand to help the drivers. Alan Binney, car number 111, a Peugeot, had troubles of his own. He'd crashed into a ditch and put 2 4-inch long splits in his crankcase. He patched it up with some bituminous pitch he found on an old battery and had melted it on his spirit stove. Binney had to repatch the crankcase 4 times. He then hit a cow at high speed, killing it, all before he reached Mount Isa. Cars should have been 2 minutes apart, but they were all over the place. Drivers were driving blind. At times, sheets of red dust streamed down windscreens. Cars twisted around hairpin bends and zoomed down sharp drops to rock beds. And was there a secret control? You betcha. Right in the middle of all this.
The telegraph car's flagged down too, and co-driver John Jones gives the definite impression that he'd rather see the control someplace else. Secret controls so far have cost competitors many points. And who should be next along but our old friend Jack? What with breakdowns, trying to make up lost time, and now a secret control, the Sporting Car Club officials are about as popular as Bob Dyer, and Jack tells them so. Mr. Davy, please. Oh, well, hey-ho, and thanks for listening, but we've no time to play hopscotch. So up anchor, boys, and let's go. Well, that Austin's practically gone.
The Isa control point looked like a scrapyard. Residents said cars were in much worse condition than last year. Shattered windscreens, broken springs, shocks and dented mudguards were the order of the day. Muffler and exhaust pipes had either disappeared or were rattling along the ground. At the control in Isa, the tally showed the toll. 30 teams had withdrawn between Townsville and Isa. Of the 114 clean shooters that had left Townsville, only 3 were left. Number 159, taxi owner Martin Arentz in a Ford Custom Line. Number 25, a Vanguard driven by Doug Whiteford. And the third was number 256, a Ford V8 driven by Jack Murray. The remaining 214 cars headed out for Darwin, where all cars were due to be checked over by officials. This meant drivers had to speed to arrive early and make any necessary repairs. Despite the roads being as smooth as a billiard table, there was trouble. Most drivers had been trapped for speeding by a secret control just 28 miles from Isa. Ken Tubman, last year's winner, withdrew after he had clutch trouble. He stayed in Katherine to have parts machined. One of the clean sheeters, Martin Arentz, lost 45 points, which left Murray and Whiteford as the leaders. Official scrutineers began making checks after the first 26 cars had arrived in Darwin. They looked for any changes to sealed or marked parts. If any of the marked parts had been changed, the offending team could face a loss of 500 points per part. Like last year's event, Darwin gave the teams a chance to rest. On Saturday, the 10th of July, the first cars streamed out of Darwin. Drivers were headed out into the Never Never on the way to Broome. Excited locals knew this to be an even worse stretch than the Calamity Trail, and it was expected that many would get stranded. Organisers had insisted each car carry enough food and water to see them into Broome. But it was south of Katherine, around Wave Hill, that dust trapped drivers. It was so deep and fine, a local farmer pulled the cars out with his tractor for £1 and £2 at night. At one stage, there were 47 cars stuck at once. Between Wave Hill and Halls Creek, clean sheeter Doug Whiteford bit the dust. The deep dust threw up an impenetrable screen, and his vanguard slammed into the back of a slowing Rover. The front end was smashed and the radiator holed. He and his team took 4 hours to get the car going. They then risked their lives on the dusty bush track by driving more than 63 miles an hour to make up time. He lost 70 points at Broome, making Jack Murray the hot favourite to win. 26 severely damaged cars withdrew. To prevent stranding, they formed a convoy back to Katherine. Crashed cars littered the road to Christmas Creek, where there was an official checkpoint and a 6-hour rest break. With over a day's driving and much coffee drinking, sleep was on everyone's mind. At Christmas Creek, women competitors were invited into the homesteads for a shower, a meal and a bunk in a cool room. With a couple of exceptions, all other competitors were under threat of disqualification if they even approached the homestead itself. The men slept on verandas, under trees or anywhere comfortable. They bathed in nearby creeks and dams. With a few hours sleep and a hot meal, their spirits picked up. At this stage, there were only 180 cars left in the trial. The stretch to Broome almost saw the only clean sheeters, Jack and Bill, no relation Murray, out of the trial. Their Ford V8 was running on empty. They turned a corner and found a broken down car. Offering to tow it in return for the car's remaining fuel, the Murrays arrived at control in Broome on time. Broome was the halfway point. Time to relax and recharge the batteries, both human and car. It was to be a 24-hour stopover, but officials changed it to 22 hours to narrow the field. This angered latecomers, who by the rules would be the first to leave, giving them only 18 hours rest. A further 13 cars dropped out, and a furor erupted over points, timing and bad organisation generally. One report said that due to the bad press officials were receiving, no one was prepared to volunteer. Eventually, the local REDeX PR guy nabbed a friend and got stuck into it.
A
167 cars left Broome and headed out to Meekatharra, passing through Port Hedland and Marble Bar. Troubled officials announced that the stopover would be extended to 12 hours at Meekatharra because of the need for rest. Just out from Broome was several miles of mudflats. Lucky Bill Lee, number 226 in a Hudson, second car out from Darwin, took a wrong turn and was bogged for hours. Once out, he put the foot down, getting up to 103 miles an hour to make Port Hedland on time. Perce Pomeroy, in his Citroen, had to pull down a generator to fix it. Then a bump sent his exhaust up through the petrol tank, leaking out gallons of petrol. He had to solder the tank up on the side of the road. Holt Binney, tired as buggery, refused to give up the wheel of his Peugeot, number 111. "There's a wild corner coming up that I want to take," he said. It was here that he overturned the car. 3 other cars overturned. Andy Spanner turned his Chev over when the back axle snapped and the rear wheels came off. The doors flew open and everyone and everything flew out. Car number 72, a Holden, helmed by Herb Happ, crashed into one of the many creek crossings, wiping off a mudguard and denting the roof. Stopping to help, car number 202, a Dodge manned by John Burton, later blew out front tyres, causing everything inside to go through the windshield.
Ring-a-ding-dong, dip-dip-a-shama-lama, rama-lama, ding-dong, bang, shang-a-lang. Ring-a-ding-dong, dip-dip-a-shama-lama, rama-lama, ding-dong, bang, shang-a-lang.
Jack Davey was stranded miles from civilization with a blocked fuel line, damaged front suspension and a broken steering shaft. He'd taken a corner too fast, hit a rock and, well, hi-ho everybody, was stuck. Mika Thara and everyone was at the limits of their patience and nerves. Terry Byrne, Australian Sporting Car Club official, bore the brunt of all complaints and frustrations. He'd collapsed from nervous tension several times already. The Murrays were reported to have thrown gelignite, blowing up their competitors. As one story goes, the two had thrown it to get the car in front to give way. The driver of the other car heard the explosion, thought it was a blowout, and turned off to fix the puncture. The Murrays sailed past, waving and smiling at their victim. So, Jack, tell us, did you really do this?
Oh, well, we took jelly with us. So we found it was always good when you're letting the jelly off to go and find a policeman, know where he is, and go and talk to him. So when it goes off, it's not you, it's somebody else. How the hell could you let it off? There was an outhouse. So we got 3 sticks of jelly, just threw it up against the tin fence outside it. Went up speaking to the policeman. The next minute, up went the jelly. And the copper said, Christ, what was that? I said, I wouldn't know. He said, I bet it's those blokes, Murray and the 2 Murrays. And I said, that's not us. I said, I'm Murray, and that's the other one. The bloke said, you're not, are you? I said, yeah. He said, oh, well, you're out of it. I said, yeah, of course we are. So away we went. Yeah, I'll never forget that one. Yeah. Well, in the end, they used to demand it. We never did ever use it in the trial to get us out of strife. Nothing.
No, Jack, it only got you into it. At last, Perth was in sight. The rule book allowed the 61 miles from Northern into Perth to be travelled at 24 miles an hour. This distance actually turned out to be to the GPO only. It was a further 6 miles to the control point at the Perth showgrounds. Once drivers knew this, they put their foot down and travelled the last 6 miles at breakneck speeds. Perth's fervour in greeting the teams was unparalleled. Huge crowds surged in waves. Car number 203, driven by Vince Brown and Des Pinn, was first into Perth.
Car 257, JT Belling's Zephyr, 96 points down. It's tough getting to the control through the crowds, but the mass of people is more evidence of the way this trial has captured public imagination. G. Horner's Custom Line, 45 points lost. He and other crews are interviewed by Curly Bryden, who's bringing the story daily to radio listeners. Jack and Bill Murray are hot news now. Necessity certainly is the mother of invention. At the Perth Control, where crews will have a 12-hour break, there's a run on the bank. This unique mobile unit was a much appreciated service. So they draw their money, cash their travellers' checks, and prepare to put the petrol bills back to Sydney.
Pouring rain marked the departure from Perth. More cars had withdrawn, reducing the field to 144 cars. Just 28 miles out from Perth, a Ford Zephyr, number 8, entered by David Doherty with Harry Everett and Gordon Jolly, all from Melbourne, rammed into the back of a truck. A passing car found them lying on the road. They received only minor injuries and were able to fly home a day or so later. Their car was severely damaged before the accident, but now it was a write-off. Apart from this accident and some heavy fog, the drive into Kalgoorlie was on bitumen, so it was smooth sailing all the way to the checkpoint. 2 minutes later, cars were on their way out across the Nullarbor to Adelaide. First stop was Majura and a 6-hour rest. The owner of the homestead had shipped in 150 beds and would provide all competitors with a hot meal. Teams that were bedless would have to sleep in their cars as the heavy rain had waterlogged the ground. In fact, the road ahead was mostly underwater. But it wasn't bog cars that made the news. Somewhere near Canalda, just 15 miles east of the South Australian border, Arthur O'Shea and Walter Wright in car number 246, a Citroen, scuttled from a burning car seconds before it exploded. They were travelling along at 50 miles an hour when O'Shea spotted flames coming out the back. "Get out!" he yelled, only seconds before the car went whoosh. They watched helpless as one by one the tyres exploded, the reserve petrol tank blew, and the car was reduced to a molten heap. The Nullarbor proved to be a dry, dusty, potholed track. Clean sheeter, Jack Murray's Ford, took a beating, but still, he continued without loss of points. Small groups of people gathered on the roadside to cheer on the drivers. One enterprising family, the Gurneys from Eucla, serviced the vehicles. Harvey Gurney bought oil and petrol, a younger brother sold biscuits and spare parts, an even younger brother carried water to the cars. Their sisters served light refreshments, while Dad worked the hand petrol pump and Mum sent telegrams. Cruising into Adelaide, the navigators had planned the arrival to the last minute. The crowds were large and under control as they lined the streets to the Morfordville checkpoint. But as in Perth, the distance and time given in the rules was based on miles to the GPO, not to the checkpoint. To make matters worse, the stay in Adelaide was reduced from 12 to just under 11 hours. Laurie Whitehead, in one of the first Volkswagens to be entered, was interviewed for local radio.
And Volkswagen number 54, driven by Laurie Whitehead, the motoring editor of the Melbourne Herald, has just come into the control point. Now I'll move over towards the Volkswagen and see if we can catch a word or two with the driver. What's been the worst stage up to date?
Undoubtedly the Cloncurry Mount Isa section was the worst, closely followed by the Catherine to Christmas Creek stretch, which was a very long one, and full of very many traps, which caught out a lot of cars. They smashed themselves up in some order.
How have you found the little Volkswagen performing?
Well, we haven't put a spanner on it since we left Melbourne. We've greased it, changed the oil, replaced 4 tail light globes and a speedo cable. Other than that, she's never missed a beat.
Well, that's a wonderful performance. And from your point of view, how would you like to do it again?
Well, in about another 5 years, it'll be all right, I think.
Melbourne had again greeted the drivers with much enthusiasm. With a scheduled 12-hour stay at the Royal Park Barracks, food and a comfortable place to sleep was a given. That is, until officials had it changed on the spot and only 6 hours was allotted for sleep and rest. Gelignite Jack made front-page news when police escorted him to the checkpoint. They then quizzed him about any gelignite he might be holding. The Murrays were still the only clean sheeters and were quietly confident of a win, though 8 minutes was all that separated them from second place. And that was a worry. "I only have to sneeze and I could lose points," Jack said. Of the 246 cars that started, only 127 headed off. The secret route between Melbourne and Sydney was revealed. The drivers would have to push on into snow country, from Orbost up to Adaminaby, Talbingo out to Gundagai, on to Canberra, Moss Vale and out to Wollongong, and finally into Sydney. Heavy snowfalls had been reported for the mountains, and this is what they were expecting to find. Wild Bill McLaughlin, who knew the road, made it clear that the 4-mile ride down Mount Talbingo would be the worst. It was a narrow road with a precipice on one side. The roads would be slippery and slushy. He advised a second-gear drive down the mountain. His advice was well taken, as many drivers were to learn. As luck would have it, the night before they were due in the snowies, it rained. It rained and melted most of the snow, but it was still cold enough to cause water to freeze on windscreens and brake drums. Having expected a secret control somewhere past Orbost, drivers kept to scheduled speeds. When they realised there was no secret control, they had to speed to make up for lost time. Onwards to Canberra, and the Murrays were still clean sheeters, despite having stopped to build a snowman and pose for photos at Talbingo. Rumours had it that a secret control would be found at Moss Vale. From there, it was over the Macquarie Pass,
which takes us in a sharp drop, tricky winding roads and hairpin bends to the coast at Wollongong. Sydney whipping a thrill into the finish, dropping down thousands of feet from the highlands in a matter of minutes. Packed up now into a serpentine safari. A real test, this, of car, brakes, tires, and driver, especially driver. As evening falls, they go through the final checkpoint at Wollongong on the beautiful south coast. Then, at the top of the pass, head up for the last 50 miles to Sydney and the finishing line. Into the night again, and not far to go. It's cool, and roadside well-wishers gather round log fires to give us a wave and a cheer.
Over 20,000 people crushed in to see the cars arrive home.
And so, at last, Sydney Showground, the spot they left 18 days ago. Walton and Gardner are first to arrive. They win a special prize as most successful West Australian entry. Now they've got a nice long drive home to Perth. Tommy Sulman's Humber, with a loss of 22 points, is second in the big car class. That secret control was costly, wasn't it, Tommy? Tom Farrell and John Jones lost their 25 points for being early at a secret control, too. Their custom line is third in the big car class, and they're very happy. And look at the rewards there are for the clean-shaven guys. They weren't beaten by a whisker. E. Nelson has driven his standard Vanguard into fourth place in the open section. High up in official placings last year, he is only 19 points down in this trial. Great going for both Nelson and the Vanguard. The country Holden entry won the important teams prizes.
All 3 points leaders were announced as the provisional winners, pending scrutineering and the hearing of protest. Bill Patterson from Victoria in car 29, a Peugeot, with 8 points lost, was announced as provisional second place getter. Duck Anderson from Queensland in car number 176, a Holden, with 14 points lost, won provisional third place. And the outright winners, Jellignite Jack Murray and Bill No Relation Murray in their Grey Ghost Ford V8 with absolutely no points lost. Jack Murray recalls the event.
And the police met us up at Moss Vale and said, if you let one stick of jelly off, you'll be locked up. Will you follow us from here to Sydney Showground? And we followed the police, 4 of them, in I think it was a Ford too. And they went faster than we'd ever been. we were flat out keeping up with them. We got there about half an hour too early. And we clocked into the showground and become more or less famous.
Peter Antill lodged a protest against the Murrays. He claimed that they didn't finish the trial in a standard vehicle, having disconnected their shocks and roll bar. The protest failed as Norm Pleasance, trial director, said there were no rules forbidding this. So each of the winners stood as complaints still came forward. However, they were mainly aimed at the officials and their apparent disorganisation of the whole trial. Lex Davison complained that the trial was not a test of driving skill or stamina, but of how long your ulcer could hold out before the next secret control. Complaints covered everything from lack of adequate rest periods, the slow speed schedule for most of the trial, which, in turn, forced drivers to travel faster over dangerous roads to catch up, and the utter confusion at checkpoints. Only 123 cars completed the course as competitors. Others, like Jack Davey, had completed the route but had already withdrawn before he'd finished. As a non-competitor, he was not allowed to do the lap of honour. Davey, not wanting to disappoint the fans, ran out onto the field anyway, amidst much cheering. On Friday, the 23rd of July, the winning ceremony was held.
navigator and relief driver. Formal salute of 21 guns for Gelignite Jack.
That to happen.
Oh, no, they can't.
Joe and Bill, this is one of the proudest moments of my life to be able to present to you the £2,000 for the outright win and the 200 extra for using REDeX in competing and winning the greatest trial that's ever been held in the world.
Jack and Bill Murray had achieved something truly amazing. While other drivers bit the dust, and in most cases literally, the Murrays paced themselves, making the most of the opportunities presented to them. Their achievement would not be an easy act to follow in future trials. Taking into account competitors' suggestions, organisers promised a longer and tougher trial for 1955, and indeed it was better organised. Longer breaks and more of them, tougher rules with next to no mods allowed, including no rhubards, were just some of them. Extras were limited to showroom options and included sports coils and temporary exhaust extensions for water crossings. Extra fuel tanks were permitted as long as they fed into the existing tank. 2 extra lights were allowed. Cars could be undercoated and the electrics waterproof. Roof bars could be fitted provided they didn't strengthen the vehicle and the car had to finish with the roof bars in place. The interior could be set out as the team wished. The route was longer this year. It included Cairns, Normanton, Duchess, Carnarvon, Broken Hill, Mildura, Mount Gambier and more snow country. This made the trip 10,533 miles long. It started on the 21st of August and ended on the 11th of September, nearly 3 whole weeks. To avoid human error with timings, Bundy clocks would be used at controls, and this year, hallelujah, there were no secret controls. Ace hot rod driver from Norwood, South Australia, Bonnie Hambley Clark, was determined to take part and was the first entrant. She was number 28 in a Renault Frégate. Just prior to the race, she and her teammates underwent hypnotherapy to make them win. Many of the other competitors, 176 in all, were those who had competed previously. Familiar faces included Eddie Perkins from Victoria, this time in a Volkswagen. Ken Tubman, outright winner of 1953. Jack Murray, last year's winner and only clean sheeter, this year with his brother Ray. The women's weekly team with replacement Betty Best. Helen Rosevear, Melbourne Baker and number 63 was back in it. Doug Whiteford, who had breathed down Murray's neck in the 54 trial. Last year's third place getter, Duck Anderson, honeymooners Bill McLaughlin and Mari Higgs. Tom Farrell, in the official Daily Telegraph entry, was favourite to win this year. Peter Antill, experienced trials driver who'd come third in 1954 and this year drove number 158, a Plymouth Savoy. Laurie Whitehead, Melbourne Herald journalist and experienced competitor in a Volkswagen number 90. They may have had trouble in previous years, but they discovered that trials were addictive. The more you got, the more you wanted. Jack Davies' health kept him out of this year's trial, but he still wanted more, and he got it, but this time as the official non-starter.
Mrs. Shepherd, wife of the founder of the trial, flags out number 1, a Vanguard driven by A.W. Stanfield of Mascot, New South Wales. And then the cars begin to leave at 2-minute intervals. Many cars are painted vivid colours, and most are covered with sign writing. Practically anything you could think of is advertised on some car somewhere in the trial. One features bubble gum, another a super rat trap, while a third urges everyone to buy somebody's sensational new brassieres. Beards are amazingly plentiful this year. At least half a dozen have passed through so far, with less than a quarter of the field away. Jack Murray, who won the trial last year, comes to the line with the same car full of balloons. For the children, he says. His famous 1948 Ford V8 attracts a lot of attention. And the car following Murray is the Vanguard Spacemaster driven by Eric Nelson and Neville Vale of New South Wales. There are only 3 sports cars in the trial, and 2 of them are MGs. This Triumph TR2 is the fastest car in the trial, with a top speed of well over 100 miles an hour.
All along the way to Newcastle and Tamworth, crowds and heavy traffic made the going slow, despite the scheduled speed, which was faster than allowed in 54. Tamworth entrant Mrs. Hall received a warm welcome. There were no controls between Tamworth and Southport. 6 accidents happened and 4 cars withdrew. 5 drivers were booked for speeding near Lismore and faced disqualification. Car number 79, a Volkswagen entered by Swedes Sten Jakobsen and Ollie Torling, crashed while overtaking another car on a corner, and they withdrew.
In the early morning, the cars passed through the township of Tweed Heads and across the Tweed River, just south of the Queensland border. It's been an easy run from Sydney on good roads all the way, but already 27 cars have lost points and 2 are right out altogether. 1 hit a bridge in dust and overturned, was badly damaged and the crew went to hospital. The other car withdrew with serious engine trouble at Glen Innes. Everyone has maintained high average speeds. Most cars have been cruising at between 50 and 60 miles an hour on these smooth bitumen highways. So they're well ahead of schedule as they cross the border into Queensland.
Southport was the first stopover, with many cars losing points.
Southport, Queensland. First stopover point in the REDeX trial. It's been comparatively far, but already some cars have lost points. Now the 176 drivers get ready for the first horror stretch. Jack Murray, last year's winner, is going well, but the next 500 miles may well be the crucial point of the entire trial. Out of Southport they go, heading north.
"10,000 turned out to cheer drivers as they passed through the control in Fortitude Valley, a suburb of Brisbane. This year, the stop in Brisbane was only a few minutes. Out to Toowoomba, Kingaroy, Dalby, and then on to Maryborough saw a 50-mile-long heavy fog keep drivers in line despite the dangerous speeds they had to drive. Charlotte Hayes, a 66-year-old grandmother who'd watched hubby in last year's trial, was late into Maryborough. "We got lost 3 times, she claimed. One competitor, who'd lost a point, complained that the Bundy clock was wrong. Officials returned the point when they discovered that the clock had been unplugged for about a minute and a half. One driver was forced to drive blind when a bucket of water was splashed across his windscreen and turned the dust and grime into a stream of mud and sludge. This stretch claimed 4 victims, with 2 of the competitors sent to hospital. Jack Green and Bill Sadler, in number 116, an MG sports car, struck the edge of a concrete culvert, skidded and hit a large tree head-on. Green was pinned under the car and Sadler wandered around dazed. Both were hospitalised and out of the trial. There was a 15-hour rest at Rocky where several issues came to the fore. The first one had to do with the faster speeds. Although last year's complaints were that the trial was too slow, this time round, drivers couldn't keep up the pace. The scheduled speeds, and thus the times, were not realistic. They didn't really take into account the bad stretches where conditions forced slower speeds, which meant that on the better stretches, drivers had to really gun their cars into control points. It was all too dangerous.
It's a grueling race against time, and Borra's Volkswagen 120 just makes it with seconds to spare. He's not quite so lucky later on, and at the Tennant Creek, he was forced to withdraw. He's not alone either. Borra clocks in at the control, and a couple of minutes later, he's off again, temporarily.
The rest period allowed them to refuel, change the oil and other such preparations. Drivers knew that one of the first and worst sections lay ahead of them.
There are thrills and spills galore, the excitement holds us tense. Tomorrow and the Rocky Rodeo,
The 141-mile rock-strewn bush track between Marlborough and Serena was riddled with creek crossings, 128 of them. It would be a miracle if anyone could go through without loss of points. The speed set was 42 miles an hour, and everyone knew it would be impossible to stick to. Everyone also knew that the field leaders would be extremely determined on this stretch.
Halfway through the 144-mile section, Nelson is still ahead, keeping to the 43-mile-an-hour average by very hard driving. But right behind him is Murray in the big grey Ford. For mile after mile, he sits a few hundred yards behind, pushing Nelson to his limit. They force their cars along this rough bush track, up and down steep creek crossings, at a shattering pace. Both cars take a terrific battering as Nelson fights to keep the lead.
For Duck Anderson, last year's third-place getter, the horror stretch was a disaster. In number 81, a Holden, he smashed into a cattle grid which flew up, pushing the bumper bar into the radiator. He lost only 84 points at control, but the damage meant a loss of 500 points, so he withdrew. The locals who set up the control in Serena didn't expect any car to arrive within an hour of the scheduled time. So when Eric Nelson in number 47, a Vanguard, roared in at 5 minutes after the hour, a lot of bets were lost. He lost only 5 points. Jack Murray had led the field until a tyre blowout forced him to stop. Nelson saw his opportunity and, foot to the floor, went hell-bent for leather and took the lead. After this, the road to Cairns was a joy, especially with a 27-hour rest waiting for him. Even so, 3 cars overturned and some arrived with parts lashed together with wire or rope. A New Guinea entrant, E. Crevolt, number 160, a Peugeot, hit a tree near Innisfail. While he had escaped injury, his passenger Mick Scott was admitted to hospital with exhaustion and a broken jaw. With his driver door missing, Crevolt looked for another navigator to man his Peugeot. He was forced to withdraw when he couldn't find one.
And others have stopped too, but for different reasons. Here is car 10 with driver Bland and his crew repairing parts broken over the last grueling section. Out of the trial and lots to put together again to get back home.
Cairns had its own entry. The City of Cairns, number 168, a Vanguard Spacemaster driven by Keith Thallon. At one stage, Thallon was only 13 points down and in third place with a good chance of winning. But by his departure from Cairns, he was 39 points down and would need to work hard not to lose any more. The first arrivals were greeted by young women who put leis around their necks. Photographers and the press pushed forward. One asked Murray to kiss the woman beside him. He looked at her, asked where her boyfriend was, and New Guinea was the reply. He plunged her into a swoon, although she wasn't impressed with the taste of him. Too much dirt, she reckoned. Over 6,000 people turned out to see the cars in Cairns Parramatta Park Control. It was here that the cars would receive their first scrutineering since leaving Sydney. Dan McFarlane checked the cars with a Geiger counter. The car's parts were painted with radioactive isotopes for easier recognition of replaced parts. By this stage of the trial, all drivers had lost points. After scrutineering, the leaders were Eric Nelson in first place, Laurie Whitehead in second place, and in third was Eddie Perkins. Rest and relaxation had prepared the remaining 128 drivers for the next horror stretch to Mount Isa and the Calamity Trail. One of the first victims was Norman Purnell in a Morris Oxford number 156. He tried to pass another car and shot out at 60 miles per hour onto a grassy field strewn with boulders. The steering was smashed and he abandoned the car. One-time favourite Tom Farrell in the Daily Telegraph's custom line was ousted at Hewenden. Apart from slinging the car into a ditch when he blew a tyre out, the diff, bone dry and glowing bright red, was about to give out. They discovered earlier that the mechanic in Cairns had absent-mindedly forgotten to put oil in the gearbox. They fixed it quickly enough, but what they didn't know until the oil seals blew was that he double-dosed the diff. The women's weekly team struck trouble after Hewenden when they skidded off the road into an anthill. They bounced back onto the road with the front suspension gone and a buckled front wheel. A little further on, a pothole damaged a rear wheel so badly it couldn't be driven. Other drivers stopped to help, and eventually the car made it into Julia Creek for repairs. Luckily, they reached Mount Isa before the control closed. It was estimated that over 30 vehicles lay broken down between Duchess and Isa alone. Many crews had abandoned their cars, choosing to walk into Isa. The most unfortunate breakdown was leader Eric Nelson. He was driving fast near Cloncurry when he hit a huge roo. The impact smashed the radiator back into the engine block. He'd only lost 5 points and was well ahead of time when the accident happened. But now, he was out of it. This put Laurie Whitehead in the lead. A 104 cars headed out of Mount Isa to Darwin. Number 110, a Volkswagen driven by Frank Kleinig, hit a cow before Camberwell. The crew was knocked unconscious and the car's electrics were fused, but they didn't withdraw. 2 drivers passed through Camberwell without checking at the control. They'd had enough. They were heading back home. Bill Cook and Norman Saville escaped from their car seconds before it burst into flames just south of Darwin. The fire destroyed their Vanguard Spacemaster, number 180, and they lost everything. George Tosh and Max Glass worked against the clock replacing the big end of their Ford, number 98. They weren't penalised for replacing engine parts, but they lost 532 points for being late into Darwin. Over the bitumen road to Darwin via Tennant Creek, the drivers had to average over 40 miles an hour. These high average speeds and rough roads were taking their toll on drivers. Many had rolled or hit something and were now driving on their nerves. The motto now was, take things easy. A 27-hour rest in Darwin was just what the doctor ordered. The cars were again scrutinised and an interesting thing showed up. Drivers claimed they had picked up radioactive uranium ore dust around Isa. They blamed it for strange faults in their electrics. No one took it seriously, but when Spacemaster number 167 was examined with the Geiger counter, 2 new springs fitted just before Isa sent the counter crazy. Those who had competed in the 54 trial knew that the stretch to Broome could be the final straw for them. The roads had not improved, and when 97 cars headed out, it was with the expectation that they may not reach their destination. At the Catherine control point, 2 large trackers were waiting should they have to pull anyone out of the sands that lay south. 3 cars pulled out of the trial here. They just couldn't go any further. At least half of the cars were 3 hours late coming into Halls Creek on the way to Fitzroy Crossing. Even the mighty Murrays were 1 minute late. As many as 20 cars were believed to be broken down somewhere before Halls Creek. Sydney driver Frank Kleinig's Volkswagen was in trouble again. The little Volkswagen died with its tyres on. 3 of them anyway, Kleinig said, with a tear in his eye. The general feeling was that this first Western Australian section was far worse than anything they'd experienced to date. making it into Fitzroy Crossing for an 8-hour break with the 5 leaders, Laurie Whitehead, Carl Kennedy, Eddie Perkins, Arthur Parker and Jack Murray. The drive out of there saw several cars withdraw at Broome. Many had broken down. The women's weekly team had radiator trouble and were the last to leave the crossing. Reg and Elaine Lenihan broke down with gearbox trouble. They tried to repair it, but ended up driving to Broome in second gear and arriving an hour behind time. In Broome, Carl Kennedy lost 148 points and was out of the lead. This put Perkins ahead to second place and brought W. Edmondson in as number 5. 20 cars withdrew at Broome, including Bill Mayer, the Hambley Clarks, Kleinig, Walton and Gardner from Bunbury, the last of the WA teams, and the women's weekly team. South of Broome, it was reported that all southbound traffic was racing out of Broome to beat the REDeX cars across the Pardue Sands. A difficult stretch at any time, it would be 100 times worse after the trial cars had sped through it. Sand apart, another hazard heading north to Broome was a 16-wheeler carrying over 10 tonnes of explosives. Coming to meet Jack Murray, you say? Not on your life. Gelignite Jack had lain all that to rest. The only explosive things he carried this year were balloons. A.W. Robshaw got his Chevrolet, number 122, stuck so deep in the sand that when he revved the car hard, the engine came off its mountings. It fell at an angle, breaking all the fuel lines. The first 12 cars to reach Port Hedland had not lost any points from Broome, and the first 4 placings were unchanged. Teams headed into the hotel for showers, food and sleep. Private accommodation was also packed out, and any veranda beds were used on a roster basis. The first car, a Space Master driven by Doug Hughes, was carrying the Bundy clock. The clock and officials had been on its way by air when the plane was forced to land at Marty Station. This meant that only local people were manning the controls. Many drivers praised the running of the control, saying it was the smoothest one they'd yet encountered. 600 residents braved the cold of the morning to welcome the new arrivals. Less than half the cars had not lost points and all leads were maintained. The Volkswagens were given the most attention, and when 66-year-old Charlotte Hayes arrived in hers, she was greeted extremely warmly. As the cars approached Perth, they found that REDeX fever had hit the city. Crowds and crowds of people lined the streets and roadways leading to Cottesloe Civic Centre, where the cars would spend the weekend. Motorcycle police were at Midland Junction to escort the cars in without hindrance from the crowds. It was the first major capital city the competitors had seen in almost 16 days. The noise and the crowds affected them. They laughed and cheered along with the crowds, wore grins from ear to ear, and yelled their greetings out to the spectators. And every minute there'd be a squeal of brakes as drivers suddenly averted collisions. The welcome certainly surprised the officials, who weren't expecting too much after last year's fiasco. Over the weekend, the cars would once again be scrutinised. Whitehead refused to leave his car until all the checking was done. Too many rumours circulated that he and Perkins had replaced parts on their Volkswagens. He finally relaxed when the car was given a clean sheet. On Monday, the cars headed out on the tiring haul to Ceduna in South Australia via Norseman, where they'd have a 2-hour rest. Then on to Majura and Eucla. The road was straight, flat bitumen, which gave way to severe corrugations out over the Nullarbor Plain. In Kalgoorlie, 200 people waited until 5 a.m. to see all the cars drive through. Murray lost 5 points at Norseman, but still held 3rd place. One of the best things about Norseman, the team said, was the fully cooked breakfast provided by the CWA. Just west of Eucla, while stopped at a rabbit-proof fence to open the gate, Peter Antill's Plymouth Savoy was rammed in the back at high speed. The offending vehicle, a Vanguard number 138, driven by Don and George Roberts, was travelling at about 70 miles per hour. The rear of the Plymouth was totally caved in and the Roberts car was a write-off. Amazingly, the most serious injury amounted to a split lip. Anthill continued the trial. The car leading the field right into Ceduna was Gordon Bray's Peugeot, number 31. The Peugeot had broken a sway bar back in the Kimberleys and spent the extra time fixing it to stop the car from breaking up underneath. Whitehead, Perkins and Murray still held the 3 top spots. The road encouraged the drivers to race, getting up to 70 miles per hour in the better strips of road. It gave them extra time in Ceduna, over and above the 9 hours scheduled to make any repairs. For the 20 miles to Adelaide's Norwood Oval, crowds waited expectantly for the trial cars to appear. By now, there were only 69 cars left in the trial. All drivers reported a good run from Ceduna, the road being A1. A small boy throwing stones from the side of the road at Carpathia was the only incident that hampered their run. Tasmanian entry, J.E. Pedley in his Austin, number 25, was stopped by police in Clare after a short chase down the main street, and R. Scarlett in a Vanguard, number 17, called in from Port Augusta to say, "I've had it," and he withdrew from the trial. A quick survey of the remaining cars showed that only a few of them were roadworthy. Body damage, engines latched together, worn-out drivers and crews made it apparent that the trial was too long. Shepherd had argued this at the beginning, but his protests were ignored by the Australian Sporting Car Club. As the cars left Adelaide, rain was forecast for the Broken Hill area, the next port of call. What appeared to be a straightforward run to Melbourne was anything but. The road out of Broken Hill to Mildura had the dubious reputation of being the worst main road in New South Wales. Its surface was red clay, which, as we all know, even at the hint of rain turned into a deep and sticky quagmire, which is exactly what it did. The first 50 miles out saw cars slithering and sliding like a bunch of drunks. A few miles on, the rain had been heavier, the surface softer, and, you got it, the cars sank deep down into it.
The bridge across the Murray River is a welcome sight. Mildura is only a few minutes away now. The mud has made averages hard to maintain, and nearly everyone hurries into Mildura control. But Laurie Whitehead in Volkswagen number 90 has taken it in his stride. He's 5 minutes ahead of time.
Running 15th with 420 points lost was car number 111, Raisin Joe. Entered by Mildura's Vine Fruit Growers Progress Association, it was crewed by Bob Williams and Miff Johnson. Raisin Joe had been a popular car all along the way, and for good reason. They distributed packs of dried fruit to spectators and fellow competitors. They also held a hometown advantage when it came to knowing all the detours around the road from Broken Hill. They weren't alone though. Brothers Eddie and Lance Perkins, still running second, were from nearby Coangi, just over 120 miles away.
Volkswagens were one of the few makes of cars that could get service from one end of the country to the other. Outside Horsham, the local dealer waits to give them a friendly hand. And here's John LaFoe in R.S. Upton's Vanguard. He's one of the most spectacular drivers in the trial and gets a big welcome. Everyone makes Horsham on time.
Arriving in Mount Gambier, the position of the leading cars had not changed. although Murray had dropped another 15 points in Mildura. He had to push his car out of the control due to a flat battery. Melbourne gave the cars a hero's welcome. At least 200,000 people lined the streets and another 50,000 were crammed at the control point.
Every car gets a cheer. Car 118, Alexander's Dodge, down 371 points, but still in it despite the bumps.
Police barriers failed when the Murrays arrived, releasing a line of balloons from their car. They were asked to stop as the cars behind couldn't get through. But the response to the Murrays was nothing compared to what leaders Whitehead and Foreman received from their hometown crowd. Whitehead said his car was perfect and he was not worried about scrutineering either here or in Sydney. He had a small crack, but no structural damage at all. There were now 65 cars left in the trial, and a sorry lot they were too. Whitehead was to lose 5 points along the road to Corryong. The Midder River was in flood near Tallangatta, and cars had to make a 45-mile detour. All but 10 cars lost points at Corryong for being late. Next stop, Tumbarumba. The residents greeted the cars with confetti and kisses. The winding roads onto Canberra through Batlow, Tumut and Wee Jasper would really test drivers' skills, but no one was really prepared for what was to come. The muddy ordeal came without warning. 11 miles past Wee Jasper, they were told, go to the grid and turn sharp left. In the dawn light, they were confronted with a huge paddock 50 metres over a ridge where the ground was like quicksand. Here, there and everywhere, cars became bogged. Engines revved, wheels spun uselessly, only digging them in further. The air turned blue from the driver's frustrations. Des Pinn, who was involved, recalls what happened.
I said, we need a second section. And I said, I've been through the road and down to Wee Jasper and up the mountain before they go into Yass and back to Canberra. I said, no, there is a road, actually 2 roads, but if you go in the second one, you can go through, you come out near Murray-Bateman. I did it in the summertime when it was dry, and it could get very wet. I could see it was a possible trouble. I didn't see it, I only heard about it. I believe that one stage to about 90 cars stuck. Cars who think drove around it. It's all pebbles and you could drive quite happily around it, no trouble at all. By the time they came out towards Canberra, half the cars from the back are now at the front. So that's why we had to wipe the whole section. We had to.
The next stop was Canberra, via Murray-Bateman, and then a 2-hour stop in Goulburn, where, without exception, the teams laid formal complaints against the inclusion of this stretch. Their anger grew when they discovered that the Canberra Sporting Car Club had recommended it not be included due to the heavy rain that had fallen. But you can imagine their language when they found out that the ASCC organising committee, knowing it was impassable, had decided to leave it in. Jack Murray said he was done with the ASCC. He would never participate in another of their events, and his comments were echoed by others. Leaving Goulburn, the teams headed towards the Macquarie Pass down to Wollongong. At least the road was bitumen. In Wollongong, the crowds were mightily enthusiastic. The competitors were greeted with blasts from hundreds of car horns. This was the last leg. In a few hours, they'd be back where they started, almost 3 weeks ago. Putting everything that happened behind them, the teams flogged their cars the last few hundred miles into Sydney and into glory.
Parramatta Park. And here's Perkins arriving at the finishing line, 10,500 miles and only 66 points lost. Ed and Lance Perkins get a tremendous reception as the men who at the moment are second in the trial. They get lays and all as they check in at control. The little Volkswagen moves off to make way for the next one in. And sure enough, it's our old friend, South Australia's Parkinson. He's lost 2,500 points. A lot of Juco, a bit of mudguard, and probably a stone in weight, but he's made it. 58's another Volkswagen, and it gets a particular welcome because it's driven by Mrs. Hayes of Victoria. She lost lots of points, but the welcome and the bouquet make it well worthwhile. Ken Tubman, first REDeX winner, is well out of it this time. This year's heroes are Melbourne journalist Laurie Whitehead and co-driver Bob Foreman. They put up a remarkable performance with only 27 points lost, including 11 in the quagmire. Later, like the second car, they're penalised 500 points for damage. Penalties, which as this edition goes to press, are under hot dispute and the subject of strong protests. Whitehead gets a hero's welcome, and he deserves it.
After all that, Whitehead lost out to Brooks. Perkins lost out to WL Pitt. Whitehead was third, with Perkins in fourth. And Murray was disqualified for not getting to the final scrutineering point before it closed. What had happened? How could the best, the longest and the toughest trial end with such an anticlimax? Well, this wasn't the end, and it wasn't so simple. In a nutshell, Laurie Whitehead crossed the line as the leader on points. When his and Perkins' Volkswagens were scrutinised, they lost 500 points each for cracks. This put Brooks in the lead. So, on the 14th of September, it was announced that the probable provisional winners were Brooks, Whitehead and Perkins. But protest accompanied this announcement. On the 15th of September, it was announced the winner was someone who had been overlooked in early forecasts of place getters. It also appeared that protests against Brooks were upheld. So, where to from here? On the 16th of September, the committee's list for the first three provisional winners ran like this. Carl Kennedy and Bill Turner in first place with 236 points lost. G&L Cook in second place with 399 points lost. And in third place, Bill McLaughlin with 506 points lost. Whitehead and Perkins came in fourth and fifth respectively. Laurie Whitehead made this statement to the press.
My crewmate Bob Foreman and I think a lot of other competitors, feel that we've won everything in this 1955 REDeX trial but the cash and the trophies. I think we can leave it to the public to judge the trial results on performance and not on the odd interpretation of a set of ambiguous rules.
Whitehead, Perkins and Brooks lodged protests with CAMS, the Confederation of Australian Motorsport. The ASCC held fast to their decision and further claimed that they would not bend to the will of the big motor firms. For the president of the ASCC, it was pretty straightforward. It would not be fair to the amateur drivers, he said. The hearings of the Confederation took a few months to complete. Its finding upheld the protests of Whitehead, Perkins and Brooks. Finally, the outright winners were announced. In third place, Malcolm Brooks with 45 points. In second place, Eddie Perkins with 27 points. And picking up the prizes and endorsements,
Introducing Laurie Whitehead, winner of the 1955 Round Australia Reliability Trial.
And that was it. The longest and toughest Round Australia trial ever was over. Red Shepherd announced there wouldn't be any more trials. For him, it was clear they'd served their purpose, to firmly establish REDeX as a household name. But there was more to the REDeX trials than an elaborate marketing ploy. The sense of danger, the endurance of crews and cars on show at every turn, fueled a nation with excitement and then some. The REDeX trials fueled the need for change and innovation. They highlighted the need for cars to be made tougher for Australia's conditions. Some of the changes that came into place soon after were stronger shocks, greater clearance allowances, larger fuel tanks, and general strengthening of body and parts. Later, there were other similar trials, Ampol, Mobil Gas, but they never really caught the imagination of the nation like REDeX. So unashamedly tough, ambitious, and emotionally demanding were the REDeX trials that they went on to inspire Hollywood. You've seen or heard of the Cannonball Run film starring Burt Reynolds? Unknown to many, they took their cue from the Australian REDeX trials. What shines most from each of the REDeX trials is the spirit of adventure, no matter how physical or emotional the cost. For everyone who participated, the trials weren't just about the thrill of a ride. In their bones, they felt the thrill of accomplishing what had never been accomplished before or since, because, sadly for us, there can never be another trial like REDeX again.